So, good afternoon, Dr. Chris.
Good
Welcome to
afternoon.
the book review.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, before I start to yap too much, um, thank you so much for this book. So, I will start by talking about my experience with I'm Good Enough.
Okay.
I started reading it in March, and I think after the introduction, where we got to a place where you now said, before you start reading this book, write a letter. I remember closing the book and not touching it again because that letter, just considering writing the letter meant that I had to like be very, very honest with my feelings. Actually, I did write a letter. I recorded it in a journal, and just reading that letter and actually like telling myself everything. I was forced to like look at everything that had happened. I was forced to react to it. I was forced to say, ah. I just when I realized in the middle of March that I was like a really, really, really not a very good place. And no matter how strong I was, no matter how much I was moving on, these things had done a lot to, would I say, erode parts of myself. So when I started getting deeper into the place where we're talking about emotions and everything inside the book, it it became something. So yeah, all of that. But I think I have to like I regret to tell you that probably like our first answer for the first question, we'll have to redo it again. So I hope you don't
Yeah.
mind answering it again.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
fine.
So yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I think the first question had to do with me talking about the letter, and I was asking why that in the beginning of the book we started by writing letters to ourselves, and I
Mm.
wanted to, and you were talking about what this letter does for us,
Yeah.
and I wanted to also know like apart from like that self-excavation that is needed for self-knowledge, what else can letters do? So yeah, I think that was where we stopped. So please.
Yeah, so I think the point for me was self-awareness, which I think is critical
Uh-huh.
to achieving anything in life, moving
Well,
from any point where you are to the point where you want to be is self awareness. And I say this even in therapy that one of the purpose of therapy is self-awareness, is that you get in there, you sit down, and you get to explore, you get to understand, you get to become aware of yourself. It's almost like looking at the mirror and getting to see layers of yourself. And I think I was saying that the book starts with that because, again, we understand that we live in a society where we are too scared of our core self. And so we find that we do everything to distract ourselves, right? We spend time on social media. Some people will use drugs, use substances, they're partying it because there's that fear that, connecting with my true self is scary. But what we fail to recognize is that the scary part isn't your true self. The scary part are the layers that you have put up. Maybe not you directly, maybe the environment, maybe the society, but because you've heard several voices, you've heard several lies, and they have shaped who you think you are. And we become afraid of looking at that self. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to encourage people to actually look, right? Just look and see what it is. I do recognize that at the start of the book, whatever you see might be messy, right? I do recognize that. And that's why at the end of the book, you get to write something else again after going through that process, or I would say the mental surgical process of peeling off all those layers and eventually getting to see yourself. And the goal is that at the end of the book, you are able to connect with your core self and you're able to carry that core self through life, right? Through all the ups and the downs and the challenges, but never losing focus of that core self because that's what really matters, right? And that's the goal. The goal primarily was self awareness because self awareness, I think and I believe, is the foundation to discovering who we truly are.
the foundation of self-worth. I think that's the beginning of the first chapter. Okay,
Yeah.
I agree that self-awareness is, because I think there was this thing I heard somewhere that the mind has the ability to repair itself. I don't know
Mhm.
how true that is.
Yes, it
Ah,
is.
it
It
is.
is very true. Well, maybe not the mind, the brain, actually. I would say the brain has
Oh,
the
the
ability
brain.
to heal, to repair itself, to heal itself. And it's a process that has been imbued to everyone, right? And I wouldn't want to go through the biological jargons of this, but yes, the brain can actually heal itself. When we deal with even physical trauma, right? The brain can heal itself. And that's where the likes of Ben Carson became very popular and famous, because he was one of the neurosurgeons that was able to, perform a lobotomy. That means cutting off a part of the brain, and yet the person is able to function, effectively. And before that experience, that idea didn't make sense. How do you cut off a part of the brain and the person is still able to function, right? It wouldn't make sense to anybody, but it speaks to the neuroplasticity of the brain. The brain can heal itself. But in mental health, in more of psychological healing, the brain has been designed with processes to enable your survival, right? It's been designed with processes to enable your survival. And these processes enable us to heal from traumatic experiences. The problem is sometimes we might get stuck in that healing process. We might get stuck in that healing process, and that's where people like me then come in, right? To get you to become unstuck, right, by guiding you through that process. But you are very true. The brain can heal itself, and that's what this is all about. It's guiding us on that healing journey. It takes time, right? It takes time. It takes effort. I say that it takes the ability to respond, and that means that we are taking responsibility. So it also requires a lot of knowledge. You need to know things. You need to we live life from the lies sometimes and the information that we've gotten from our environment. And like I said, I use the word lies, but because sometimes these things are not true, right? These things are influenced by culture, by religion, by a lot of things. But because we don't know any different, we think they are true. And unfortunately, we build our lives based on this information, however faulty they are. Another truth that I think we also need to recognize is that the human brain doesn't work with reality, it works with perception, right? And that's why it's easy to deceive us to believe that we're not good enough. And we will be wondering. And that's why sometimes when you're having conversations like this with people, it contradicts their experience, because they are saying, if I am good enough, why do I feel this way? Right? So it doesn't make sense to them. They're saying, why do I feel this? Or why do I feel like I'm a loser? Why do I feel all these terrible emotions if I'm good enough? Right? But the answer is simple. Well, the reason why you feel that way is because your brain doesn't work with reality. Your brain works with perception. And so your brain takes whatever you believe and creates an experience for you out of that belief. So if you believe that you're not good enough, your brain is going to say, the job of the brain is to say, you know what, how do I match up that belief? Now, it's not because the brain hates you, it's not because the brain is trying to hurt you, it's because that's what it's programmed to do. And partly because when we perceive something that causes us distress, we need to be able to feel a form of that distress to be able to do something about it, right? So if, for example, I thought that I was terrible, or I'm an evil person, I'm not good enough, but I'm happy about it, right? There will be no motivation to want to do something about it or change it, or jo- respond to it, right? And that's actually also the difference between antisocial personality disorder, the psychopaths, the sociopath and psychopaths, is that they don't have that capacity to have those kind of unpleasant emotions when they reflect on negative traits. So they don't have that capacity. And so you see them hurt people, kill people without even reflecting on it. But we have that capacity because the brain brings that to us and says, this doesn't look good. So there are two things. You need to do something to get you out of this state, or you need to gain knowledge to help you realize that, no, this is not who you are. And again, this is the motive for me, is driving this personal experience, but realizing in my years of experience working with people that many people who come into my office are struggling just because they have believed a lie, and they're beginning to fulfill those lies in their lives. And I was hoping that with this book we're able to start, shaping a different mindset amongst readers and amongst people.
I have so many questions have popped up, and the thing is, I have like up to like 19 questions. Let me just slow us down a little bit.
Yeah.
I haven't introduced you yet, so if you could take like maybe like 2 minutes to tell us about like who is Chris? Because you're a clinical psychologist, I think I'm correct.
Yes, you're correct.
Yeah, so tell us about yourself and what is a day to day like for a clinical psychologist like you, and where you're from, so that I could put all of this in context.
Okay, okay. So yes, like my name is Chris, and
Mhm.
I am a clinical psychologist. I'm licensed to practice in Nigeria, and currently also practicing in Canada. I actually, started my career in substance rehabilitation, and but that was not my initial goal. My initial goal was to specialize in child neuropsychology. Um, but during my internships, I think I had this experience with my supervisor who said to me, Chris, psychologists have the clinical experience, but they don't have the business experience. So, one of the things that I think you should do is to work with somebody who can provide that business experience. And so when I started looking for jobs, I did find a job with somebody who, was, well, an organization where the owner of the organization was a psychiatrist, but had this business mindset. So I thought, oh, it's good experience to learn the business side of mental health practice. And that's how I got into substance rehabilitation. And it was good, right? It was a nice experience at the initial point until I started to realize that. So at the initial point, you're getting a lot of results, clients are doing well, and then you start to experience relapse. Many clients are relapsing, and it was a depressing moment for me, because I'm like, that means I'm not good enough. That means I don't know what I'm doing. But as I started reading research on substance rehabilitation, I realized, oh, it might take up to 7 attempts to treatment for an individual with an addiction to actually recover. So the problem wasn't me. The problem was the fact that addiction was a brain disease, and it was a difficult brain disease. But that also pushed me to start thinking that what if I could do something before it got to this stage, right? What if I could do something before people started using substance? Because I figured out that substance use wasn't really the problem. Most people who were using substances were using that as a coping strategy. They were using that as a way of dealing with life, dealing with the stressors of life. So my mindset was, okay, you know what? I need to find a way to reach people before they get to that point. And so so again, this is just how my career has moved over time. I then found out that, okay, you know what? That was when I think in 2017, that was when workplace mental health started becoming a big deal. And I said, okay, you know what, in Nigeria. So I said, I'm just going to focus on workplace mental health. Why? Because Nigeria, we didn't have, many people couldn't afford treatment. But the way workplace mental health worked is, and EAP specifically, is that the organization gets to pay for the service. And so the employees have access to the service, and indirectly, their families also could have access to the service. So it's a way of reaching up to half of the population, um, cutting all the cost and all the other things. And it also provided more preventive care. Um, but doing that work also helped me realize that, beyond providing access to care, there was a bigger problem, and that was people's life experiences and how it shapes them, how traumatic experiences shape people, how grief and loss shape people. And that has led me to focus more on trauma and grief in my work, right? So currently, the work that I do is focused more on trauma and grief. However, in my practice here in Canada, I also still do a lot of neuropsychology, neurocognitive assessments, and all of that. Uh, but my major passion is helping people deal with these traumatic experiences, um, while still keeping in touch with the workplace mental health, the neuropsychological assessments, and that's the work that I do. I think becoming an author has been something I've been working on. So I have been writing and putting down my experiences in books, and I've had a number of them. But there's this imposter syndrome that comes with many authors, where you don't think that you've written good enough,
Yeah.
and you're not willing
Mm.
to put out the work. So you just keep on writing and keep on writing until 2024. 2024 was, a challenging period for me, and at that point, I think this negative perception of self, where you think that you're not good enough, hit me, harder than ever. And while I was speaking with therapists and they're trying to help me work through this, one of the things that one day I just said to myself was, what would I do with my clients if they were going through this? And so my initial thought was, let me create worksheets that I would typically use with my clients and use that for myself, right? So starting with the letter and all the other things were things that I said, you know what, these are certain things I probably would do with my clients. So let me become my own therapist and use them for myself. And as I put that together, right, I then realized that, oh wow, these things are rich enough to share with people as well. Right. And that's basically how I pushed myself. And it was a challenge because, like I said, that's the imposter syndrome. You've been writing, but you're thinking, yeah, it's not good enough. It's not good enough. Let me just keep on writing. At that point, I said, you know what, I need to push this out, and it led to that book. I'm good enough, right? Just putting it out. It was an experience that helped me, and I said, you know what, let people get to experience it, and the feedback has been awesome, actually. Um, which has pushed me to say, you know what, go back and pick all the other ones and start working on them. So I'm working on all the other pieces that I have, but this has been a good experience for me, knowing that you can get to help people fight those beliefs and that belief that they're not good enough, which isn't true.
It's a good one. By the time I read up to this side, I'm sure I'll have a lot of I'm sure I'll have a lot more questions, because it's the content here is really compressed. Because as I'm a fiction writer, I read fiction, and well, I used to finishing books in a day. So when I picked up this one, and even when I started getting through it, I read the first chapter, and then when I came back and I was like, I couldn't. When I started reading the second chapter, I couldn't really connect with the book. So I went back to the first chapter and I started reading again, and I saw completely different things because it felt like after having absorbed those ideas and they sat with me, when I came back again, there were a lot of things that were now clearer. So yeah, it's dense, it's compressed, it's practically a textbook, and it's one of my favorite things in the world to read textbooks. Because you're getting more value for money basically. Books that you can read over and over again. My next question would be, which would be going back to the idea of self-worth, because that's, I think, the first idea that I encountered here. Um, there's a line that says, I mean, there's an idea here that says every human being has unique potential, because your value as a human being comes from who you are inherently, and does that mean that each person is completely different? Like, is there like some sort of like psychological or some sort of academic study that has proven that everybody is completely different? Because if we are all inherently who we are, does that mean we're completely different? I don't know. There's something like that.
Well, so yeah, there are many. There's research. There are many conversations around this, um, and I think when I say that we are innately we're born with this self-worth, with this potential for self-actualization, is the way the humanistic school of thought would say it, right? So in psychology, there are different schools of thought. There are different people with their different ideology about the human mind and the human behavior and the way it works. And I think two of them that or three of them that I typically subscribe to as I write this book. And again, I subscribe to a lot of them, but I do subscribe to the humanistic school of thought. I do subscribe to the positive psychology, and I do also subscribe to the behavioral or cognitive behavioral therapy approach. And you see a lot of cognitive behavioral concepts within this book. But I would
Mm-hmm.
stick to two of them. That's the humanistic school, one of the things that the humanistic fathers did say was that every person is born with the potential for self-actualization, right? That means when you're born, you have that potential to actualize yourself. To now the behavioral guys, that's the JB Watson and his crew, did say also that everyone is born tabula rasa. That means they say that we are born blank, and as we go through the world, we begin to pick information to fill up that blank slate, and that becomes who we are. But JB Watson then made a very bold statement. He says that give me any healthy child, and I can make that child whatever I want the child to be. Right? So he says if he wants the child to be a doctor, an assassin, an armed robber, a lawyer, he could make that child anything he wants the child to be. And his concept was more about behavioral programming. He believes that you could program people based on their belief, based on using behavioral techniques. But regardless of the complexity of whatever they are saying, the key theme that I think is consistent in all of these schools is that you are born with that innate self worth. Now, the reason why this is a big deal for people to comprehend is that we tend to not understand what self-worth is, and we tend to judge self-worth based on material things, right? So we think that the fact that a person is worthy means that they have a Lamborghini or they have certain material possession, but that's not what it is. And I don't know, I can't remember this scholar that said something. He says when you're born with nothing. When you die with nothing. And he then asks the question, so what is the essence of life and all the things that we try to acquire? And he says experience and relationships. And you probably would have heard many people say this, that on their dying bed, or when they speak to people who are dying, nobody ever says, I regret that I didn't buy enough cars, or I regret that I didn't have enough designer shirts. They never say this. Most of what they say is, I regret that I didn't spend time with my family. I regret that I didn't connect with people, that my loved ones. And those are the things that are really important to people. But the good part of that is when we're able to connect with our true self, with our core self, it actually puts us on a position to achieve whatever we set our minds to achieve. So the one confusion I expect that people would have while reading this book or when they read this title is they might be confused to think that what I'm saying is don't try, don't do anything, you're good the way you are. But that's not
Yeah.
right. What I'm trying to say here is that you need to connect with your who you truly are to be able to achieve what you set your mind to achieve. Right? It's how do if this is a product, if I am a product, and how do I maximize my potential if I don't already know the value of that product, if I don't already know the capacity of that product? So if I get a car, for example, and I think this car is terrible, it's not going to work, it cannot do anything, that is going to affect how well I'm able to maximize the potential of that car, right? I don't know if you ever bought a gadget that you thought was nothing, but as you explore the gadget, you realize how much this thing no small. Oh, as in this phone is not a small phone, because you get to see things you never thought could be done with the phone, right? Why is that? You're beginning to look beyond what you've already perceived. Some people probably still have an iPhone, say XR or 11, and can do more with the iPhone 11 than a person who has the 17 Pro Max. Why? Because the person who has the 11 understands the value and is able to use that phone to achieve whatever he has set his mind to. Now, the humanistic school of thought then also said something, that while we have the potential for self actualization, the problem is as we go through life, we get hit by negative life experiences, right? Things start to happen to us. You realize that your parents are not Dangote, and you don't have the kind of privilege that the, what they call them now, the Nepo babies have, which means that now you have to struggle more. All of the struggles, and if you live in Nigeria, you also have to write jam and maybe even fail jam, right? You have to realize that you arrive jam and your papers are not there. You have to wait to write the exam late into the night. All of these experiences affect your performance. They affect who you are. They affect the translation of that potential. And at some point, we start to believe the outcome that we experience as a result of all of these negative things. So the person feels jump three, four times, not because they don't have the potential, but simply because they've not had the environment, they've not had the support, they've not had the resources, right? And so they fail jump a number of times, and now they begin to believe that maybe I don't have that capacity to pass. So maybe I'm not good enough. And a good example would be I've had, when I was in school, I used to mentor a lot of students. And one of the students that I mentored, he struggled to survive school, then UI. He struggled to pass, right? Years later, this guy graduated, went to the UK. So he actually finished with the third class. And then he went back to school. And after, I think, 3 years or 4 years, he reached out to me and said to me, Chris, I just graduated the first class. This guy in school then, nobody would believe. In fact, he's the kind of story that everybody just gives up on. That. Let this guy just manage to just graduate. Sha. This is the same person, goes to a different environment, different support, different, situation, and he's stopping his class. Right? Now, that doesn't mean everybody will top their class. Why? Because it all comes down to how ingrained that belief of failure, that belief of not being good enough is. And that brings me also to something called the self-fulfilling prophecy. It is sometimes when we have this belief that we're not good enough, we unconsciously start working towards it. It's because, again, like I said something earlier, the brain works with perception, not reality. And so our perception begins to shape what our reality becomes. It shapes how we respond to people. It shapes how we will do our job in the first place. It shapes how much effort we'll put into something, right? Though, if you have anybody who has succeeded, it's not because they didn't experience challenges. It's simply because they kept on pushing despite the challenges they were experiencing. But if I already think that I'm not good enough and I experience challenges first time, second time, I'm likely going to give up and say, you know what, it's not for me, and I move on. But if I have that belief that, you know what, I'm actually good enough, I can do this, I will be more willing to keep on pushing until I see a result that corresponds to what I believe about myself. Yeah, there are a lot of theories, there are a lot of research to actually show this, that we actually are born with that potential, with that self-worth. And that's why you find out that babies are loved unconditionally. And yes, there's a place for performance, but it's not a determinant of your worth. It's not a determinant of your worth. And when you talk about the first chapter of the book, um, and I don't know if I really reflected that well, but the foundation for self-worth, and I reflected on myself, my own experience, because like I said, I'm the motivation for this book. My experience then in school, I graduated with my BSc, graduated the first class, but I realized that I'd spent years chasing that, doing everything, trying to, and
Yeah.
I remember that night, the Senate just sat. My HOD calls me and says, "Chris, what did just teased me, and then gave me an insight to say, this is what we're seeing in your results right now." And I was excited about it. Days I was happy that I called my mom, told my mom I just graduated the first class. But after that, I realized that I felt this emptiness.
Hmm.
And I was asking myself, so what is the purpose of all of these things, that all those sleepless nights, all of those purpose of all of that, right? And at that point, two things struck back to the humanistic school. They also believe that there is what we call the actual self. The actual self is who you are right now, right? Who you are right now, what you're doing right now. The ideal self is who you want to be. right? Who you want to be, where you want to get to. That's your ideal self. But they then said something. They said that the gap between the ideal self and the actual self determines how much distress we will feel. So the wider that gap, where you are right now, where you want to be, the wider that gap, the more distress you feel in your life. So when people feel depressed, when people feel anxious, when people experience most of these mental health concerns, it's because there's a wide gap between where they are, what is the actual self, and what they hope to be or what the ideal self is for them. But as I reflect on this in my own experience, I started asking myself that, okay, you know what, this is what is happening to me right now. I've always, this was an ideal self, at the end of 4 years, graduated with the first class, was an ideal self, right? Now I'm at an ideal self. And I would expect that that distress should be dealt with. But the humanistic school of thought then said something. For every ideal self you achieve, it becomes your new actual self. And another ideal self is created. And so we never stop experiencing distress. They stopped here. They said, you know what? We will just keep on experiencing this distress. But as I thought about it, I then asked myself, what can I do to not be trapped in this circle? And I then came up with something called the core self. And that's why when I
Self.
talk about the inherent self-worth, that's what I'm talking about, the core self. And I asked myself, what is this core self for me? And that core self is that constant part of me that remains there in both worlds, in the actual self and in the ideal self. But t- listen, now this core self is the aspect of yourself that makes the ideal self possible. It is your qualities, your strengths that helps you get to the ideal self. But the problem is we never take note of it because we are constantly looking at the actual and the ideal. But we fail to recognize that there is something that is always going to be with us. And that thing that is always going to be with us is actually what makes that ideal possible in the first place. The actual and the ideal are fluid, but the only constant thing is the core self. It's good to celebrate the ideal, but what we should be celebrating is the core self. And that's what this book is really all about. It's helping us connect with that core self that is good enough and can help you achieve whatever you set your mind to because it has helped you achieve things in the past. It's been there from when you were in primary school. It's still there. And if you're going to achieve anything, you need to be able to tap into that core self because it's good enough. It's good enough. Your actual self might not reflect what you want. Your ideal self, you might not be there yet, but that core self is what you need. And that's what that foundation really is all about. It's getting to connect with what matters the most and what is always going to be with you now and forever, which is your core self.
Yeah. I think I have actually carried like a version of what you just said now about a core self because I like to do things with my time and I realized that how would I put it? There's a part of me that would I say I see clearer across the places I've been in, whether I'm writing, talking. That's what even brought me to one of my best lines that I read so far, where you wrote, "There is no such thing as a normal person. There is only an authentic person." So, first, I think we've already touched on how we sort of like lose sight of that authentic person. But then I'm not thinking, how do we find this authentic person? And if we find this authentic person, is it possible to lose this authentic person again?
Losing and finding. Um, the word finding for many people might mean something different, right? And that's the trick. Again, I think the biggest challenge we have is English language and how one word can mean several things. And We just need to be able to understand what it truly means. And so when I use the word finding, discovering, it's not necessarily like, it's not, I would say it's more like how, Christopher Columbus discovered America and all these other places. But it's the same way that word is being used, when you get to a place and say, oh, I discovered gold here. Well, there was gold already. So, and so that's the key thing, is that this authentic self, this core self, is already there. And so maybe for me, the word discovered and find is more of becoming aware of it, right? It's that this thing is there, you just didn't know it was there. And now you become aware that, oh, there's something here that I wasn't aware of, right? And that's what it is for me. It's awareness. And I think one of the things that book really does is it understands that for us to get to a point of awareness, we need to be convinced of what we are sensing. There has to be that faith. And that faith usually it comes with evidence. Unfortunately, for so many people who are at the point where they are doubting themselves or thinking they're not good enough, is that they have probably had more evidence to tell them they are not good enough. So, for example, they failed exams. For example, they've lost jobs. For example, they've not been able to achieve some social status. They've lost relationships. They've had grief. They've had trauma, and all of these things begin to create a smoke screen or blurry vision, such that they're not able to now see clearly what the core self is for them. Unfortunately, over time, they begin to think that the layer that they are seeing right now is actually who they are or what they are. And so one of the things that I try to do, and I would say it's the things where to start from, is first that awareness journey. But that awareness journey is empowered by your understanding of emotions. It's empowered by your understanding of your thoughts and the working of your mind. It's knowing the relationship between your mind and your emotions. It's also knowing how your emotions, your mind, and when I say your mind, I mean your thoughts, how they influence your reactions. And taking a step to realize that these things are not necessarily a reflection of your core self or your authentic self. If anything, you need to bend them to match or become consistent to your authentic self, right? And I use that word deliberately. You need to bend them, right? Why? Because your thoughts wouldn't automatically, because you said, I want to read this book from Dr. Chris, I am good enough. Your thoughts would not suddenly just start becoming good enough. You have to bend those thoughts. And so most of the concepts that I speak about are concepts to help you realize why those thoughts are bendable and why you need to bend them. Um, and that's what it's all about. It's connecting to your authentic self by removing the layers. And the layers here are things that have been shaped by your environment, by your experiences, by failures, in quotes now, by negative, by trauma, by grief. All of these things have shaped what you are now seeing. But what you are seeing isn't really who you are. And that's it. You're seeing something. Yes, I agree. It's valid. You're seeing something. But what you're seeing, it isn't who you are. Because what you're seeing is a reflection of all of those layers that life has, all of those jackets that life has put on you. We start by first examining our thoughts. And one of the things that I write about here is the lies that we believe. So I talk about the lies. I talk about how those lies come about. I talk about how, hearing voices from our parents, sometimes hearing voices from our environment, life experiences, all of these things shape those lies. But because the human brain works with perception and not reality, your brain is not going to sit you down and say, but these things are not true. Let's re-reason it. It's not going to do that. The brain is going to take it and say, oh, is this what you believe? Okay. And it's going to ride with it. So it's now your job to challenge them, right? To dare to dispute them and to challenge them. And so I start by saying first that, hey, the basic truth here is that you're good enough. Let's start with that. And if we start with that basic truth, then everything that contradicts this truth, let's fight them. Anything that contradicts this truth, let's fight it. Let's bend it. Let's challenge it. If it's not consistent with this simple truth that you're good enough, then let's challenge it. And as we do that, we begin to then see it clearly. It's like an illusion. We begin to see clearly and like, oh, okay, this was not true from the beginning. And so we realize that, oh, I'm not a failure. Oh, I'm not a terrible person. Oh, I'm not a weak person. We're beginning to see clearly now because we have dared to challenge from that perspective of I'm good enough. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, in the sense that, when you're born with this inherent quality, and then things sort of like pile on. And when the distress gets too much, then you kind of sort of have to walk through those layers to find the reason why they even loved you in the first place, the reason why you exist. It makes a lot of sense. It does. Because then I think that sort of answers my question that I've always had, when I always thought that maybe the goal to self-actualization is to be the most authentic that we are, right? But then again, which now led me to a completely different worry, which is, what if a person mistakes something else for their authentic self? Seeing that, there's a part of the mind that relies on perception to build, um, connect with reality rather. So what if somebody mistakes something else with their authentic self? And is there anything that can be done to pull them out of it?
Well, so I think I like that question, and I'll say that there's a simple answer to it, and there's also the more complex answer. The simple answer here is you most likely would be uncomfortable in whatever is not your authentic self.
Oh, the distress never stops.
Exactly, and that's how you know. That's how you know that no, this is not it. There's always now it might be bearable at some point, right? It might be bearable, and so a lot of people are not living their authentic self because it's bearable. A lot of people are not living their authentic self because they understand that, or they are able to live with what they have now and say, you know what, I can just cope with this, with what I have now. But what would say to people is that the distress would remain until you connect with your core self. I'm not saying, and I see this, that again, there are research to show this. And I think the core place to really look at this research would be in when we look at sexuality, for example, right? And research has shown that when people struggle with sexuality, for example, and they're saying, you know what, they just feel uncomfortable. They just feel, no matter what they do to themselves, they feel uncomfortable until they start to look beyond the sexuality and start looking at their core self. And most times, people then get to a point where they can then embrace who they truly are when they've been able to connect with that authentic self. And at that point, whatever anybody says no longer matters to them, right? Because now I'm no longer listening to you to determine who I am. I now know who I am, right? So basically, I say that the simple answer to that question is, until you get to your authentic self, the distress would remain. Until you connect with, now you might get to a point where it's bearable, which I think many people are. We get to a point where it's bearable and we can move on. But the farther you are from your authentic self, the more distress you would experience. But you might be have that financial stability, but still feel empty. And you've seen people like that, right? They've said to themselves by say age 25, I want to be the CEO of so, and they achieve it. They achieve it, but they still wake up empty. They're not connecting with their authentic self, even though they appear to have achieved the goals that they've set for themselves. Why? Because the feelings you have when you achieve goals is simply satisfaction. And many times we describe that as happiness. So I can achieve, set a goal, achieve it, and oh, good example was myself, right? Like I said, I said, you know what, finish top of my class, first class, and everything, and I did, and I was excited when I was told that news. But days later, I'm looking at myself and I'm like, so what's the essence of all of this? I'm still feeling empty, even though I have achieved what I set to achieve. And I hear people say, "Oh, now because you finished with first class, now I make you the talker now. Let me finish first." And you hear people say, "Oh, somebody tells you that I had all the money that I needed, but I felt empty." And some people say, "Let me first have, give me the money, and let me feel whether I'm empty or not." And I would say to them, "We could give you the money, we could give you all of these things, and yes, you'll be happy for a while. Yes, you'll be satisfied for a while." But at some point, there's going to be that voice that reminds you that, see, you're still not your authentic self. But you can then find people who don't have all of those things, but who have connected with their authentic self. And yet, they are happy with life. They are living the best of their lives, even though they don't have all those things that we're chasing, because somehow they've been able to connect with their core self, and they've gone to realize that their core self has nothing to do with the wealth and all of those things. It's good to have the wealth, but I say to people that it's easier to enjoy the wealth when you've connected with your authentic self. So I think that's the answer for me. It's, you are going to feel uncomfortable until you connect with your authentic self.
When we finally, like, would I say, delink our self worth from these transient things that are not our core selves, because I think I've seen that a lot of the things that people attach themselves to, like the ideal self, it's a moving target. The current self is even the moving target because a person is building, but that core self is the fixed target. So when we delink ourselves from these moving targets, what can you project what life would be like for a person who has done that?
Well, so I think it's more of when we connect with the core self, right?
Connect.
Yeah, so when we connect with the core self, what that does for us is it doesn't change. So it helps us reprioritize what the ideal is first. That's the first thing that would happen. So you get to reprioritize, what exactly do I want my ideal to be? But it also puts you in a point where it becomes easier to achieve the ideal, right? So that's the second thing that happens, because you're building from a place of self-worth, you're building from a place of confidence, you're building from a place of authenticity. So it's easier to achieve the ideal, right? Because the challenges we typically have in achieving the ideal for many people is that we already doubt ourselves. And so every time there's a challenge along the way, we give up or we change direction, right? But if you've already connected with yourself or with your core self, there's the self-doubt is limited to a large extent. And that means that you can face challenges over and over again, and but yet still keep on moving towards the ideal, right? You can change that. So what you will also then find out is that the distress is reduced significantly. And when I say the distress, I mean the distress between the actual and the ideal, because like I said, it's so you see somebody who says, oh, you know what, let's give more realistic examples. My ideal is to become, say, the president of the country, right? That's maybe, let's say that, my ideal is to become the president of the country, but I'm still contesting for local government chairman, and I'm not getting it. I could start to believe, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm a terrible person. I'm never going to achieve this, right? And at some point, I probably even give up on that dream, right? Or at some point, I start to do whatever it takes, including hurting people, just so that I get there, right? Because again, it's not because, and that's what you see in Nigerian politics, by the way. It's not because I started out as a bad person, but because the distress I feel, the emptiness I feel increases, and I need to deal with that. even if it means hurting other people, because I would then have to make a decision. Do I preserve myself or do I preserve other people? And the answer would simply mean I preserve myself over other people. So you see how politicians would choose to hurt the citizens and they don't care about that. It's not because they're necessarily bad people, but because the distress they feel from that spot of not being able to be at that ideal is significant enough for them to say, you know what, I need to preserve myself over every other person. These are things that will be eliminated because you can then find somebody who says, yes, I want to be there, but I realize that being there doesn't really make me who I am. And so in that case, I could realize that, oh, I have great plans for the country, for example, but I also realize that I'm contesting with somebody who also has great plans. I'm able to look beyond myself and look at the other person. And so if the person wins, I'm able to say, you know what, I'm going to support you because we have the same goal. The goal is to help the people. The goal is not about me dealing with my distress because that is not a thing. That is not a thing. So these are the things you see when we are able to connect, that it reduces, first, it helps us reprioritize what is important to us in the first place. And it reduces the distress that we feel on that journey. It reduces the distress that we feel on that journey. It reduces how we hurt other people to promote ourselves. It reduces that.
Mm.
And so the world actually becomes a better place just by people being able to connect to their core self. And I'm able to show empathy. I'm able to feel people's pain. I'm able to understand. I am less distracted and I'm able to then focus on what other people are dealing with. Because what we see here is that and it looks like the world is a selfish place, but the reason is simply because we are more focused on the distress we're feeling, that we're not able to pay attention to other people's distress or other people's pain. That's the big problem. Is was so concerned. And a good example, again, recently you heard of the story of somebody and her husband and all of this, and I can see a lot of people almost celebrating it on social media. But the problem here is that they are doing that because it helps justify their own space where they are in their life. And they are not able to look beyond the fact that, oh, this person is going through something. This is not a good time for this person. We should, yes, they probably made some wrong decisions, but yes, we could support them. But it's for them, it's that at least I'm not having to deal with this alone. And I feel better about myself. I feel better about myself knowing that I can tell myself that being in this position is still better than being anywhere else. And so we become
Mm.
more selfish. We show less empathy because we're not connecting with our core self.